In this video, we will cover everything that you need to know to improve your performance on the rower, from using and understanding drag factor to improving your stroke and using the force curve as a self-assessment tool to improve your technical abilities. Also, in the end, we will give you some key workouts that are specific to your individual needs. All right, let's start with the drag factor. The drag factor is a measure of how much air provides resistance to the flywheel, which is in here, of the rower. And it's going to be adjusted by the lever you will find on the side that we usually call damper. Now, why is this important? When a rower is brand new, it is calibrated so that it has a drag factor of 200 when you put the damper to 10. But over the time, with wear and tear, this number will change. That means it could be higher, so we could be at 220, or it could also be lower, so we go to 10, but it's only at a 170, 180. Now, what we can do is let us display the drag factor in the menu, and then can make sure that every device we're rowing on is exactly providing the same resistance. First, you go to the base menu. Then we click more options, and then at the top you will already find display drag factor. Now you just have to start rowing in order for the drag factor to be presented. Who should use which drag factor? For males, we usually recommend somewhere from 110 to 135. And for females, we usually recommend from 100 to 125. This is a rather large spectrum, so how do you decide on which end of the spectrum you're going to be? The drag factor basically is just a correlate to the size of boat that is simulated by the rowing machine. Meaning a larger boat is heavier, so it provides a little bit more resistance, and it allows you to connect differently with the chain. It doesn't have anything to do with how hard the rowing is, because how hard the rowing is determined by how much power you put into the chain or into the handle. But the drag factor changes your perception and how it feels. If you're on the heavier side as a male, you want to be more towards the upper end. Same for females. If you're ever on the lighter side, you want to be more on the lower end. But obviously, as with everything, this involves a bit of experimentation. So play around with the drag factor a bit to feel where you would connect the best with the handle of the rower. I usually row at a drag factor of 125 to 130. Let's say I'm doing intervals today, 4 minutes on, 2 minutes off for 4 rounds, and I want to set my drag factor. Now I'm going to start rowing. And see, I'm at a 200, which is too high for what I want to achieve today. So I'm going to lower the damper and continue to row until I am at my desired value. Now I'm at a 129, which is exactly where I want to be for today's workout. Now let's continue with the setup of the rowing machine. For this, we brought over Anaïs, as she is going to help us demonstrate. The setup is rather straightforward, and we're going to start with the footrest, and this is pretty much everything we have to do in order to get ready to row. So the usual recommendation is to put your foot in and adjust so that the strap is going to cover the widest part of your foot. If you put both feet in and tighten it, where Anaïs' shoe is the widest, the strap is covering her foot. And this is the general recommendation where we want to have the feet placed. Now, in some scenarios, we might want to adjust that a little bit. For example, if you have like very mobile ankles, that means a lot of dorsiflexion, so your knee can track very, very far in front of your toes. We might want to reduce the travel naturally by mechanically limiting our ability to get into this position and allow us to get into a bit better position while we're during our rowing stroke. So instead of taking it to a 3 as we just did, we're going to take it to a 1, and Anaïs is going to demonstrate what the difference will look like. So now you can see the strap is a bit further up her foot and her knee can't travel as far forward, naturally limiting her, and especially for beginners, maybe putting you into a better position. And see here, if you lift your knee, if you lift your heel, yeah. And as you can see here, her knee is traveling much further forward. Now, rowing is a well-orchestrated sequence of different movements while we go through certain positions. Let's start with the positions first. We have the catch and the finish position. The catch position is what Anais is going to demonstrate now. It's like from where we start every rowing stroke. She is going to have her shins vertical to the floor. The arms are nice and relaxed, and she has a relaxed grip on the handle. Her back is straight and her gaze is always forward to the display of the monitor. Her shoulders are stacked over her hips and her knee angle is relatively close. Keep in mind, this might vary from person to person, but this is what it generally could look like. Next, we're going to move to the finish position. Here, she's going to lean back slightly, have her arms by her side. The legs are extended, but not on tension, so we want to have the quads nice and relaxed. We have the heels down on the footrest of the rower, and we have the handle meeting at the lower ribs. Okay, next, let's talk about how we connect these two positions. We have the drive phase. This is when we go from the catch position to the finish position. And we have the recovery phase when we go from the finished position back to the catch. Anais is going to complete 3 full rowing strokes now. We have a sequence we always want to follow in order to be the most efficient with our technique. What we're going to do now is we dissect each part of the movement and then put it back together in the future. The first thing we're going to do here is work with the arms only. And to do so, we will grab the handle and get into our finish position. And now we straighten the arms and bring the handle back to the chest. Do this for a couple more reps. This is relatively simple. It's just the movement of the arms and the upper body. And here you just want to build a good movement pattern where you always meet the handle to the lower ribs. The next thing is we're going to take it a step further, and it's going to be hips and arms. That means she's going to close at the hip, and simultaneously, when she's opening, she's going to pull and is replicating the same movement that she just did. We start from the finish position again. From here, we're going to straighten the arms. Now we're going to close the hips. And now as we open the hips, we pull simultaneously. Here it's important that you limit the movement only to go as far forward as your back allows. And this is obviously connected to your posterior chain mobility. But then the hip allows us to generate a lot more force than just the arms only. And this is something you will see immediately with your paces that will decrease as you involve more muscle mass. Now we're going to take it a step further. And here we introduce some slight knee flexion. This allows us to practice the rowing stroke with slightly reduced complexity. Here we only want to have half of the sled instead of full sled. So she's not going to go into a full catch position. Okay, demonstrate half sled rowing. So you're limiting the travel of the seat and still have to coordinate your legs and your knee extension into the movement. Now from here, we're going to ease into the full rowing stroke. That means you can start with rowing the half sled, and then with every stroke, you slightly increase the range of motion until you're running the full sled. Let's do 3 half and then 3 full. So we continue where we left off. And with every stroke, we're introducing a bit more length and a bit more knee flexion. As you practice this, always keep in mind that you want to follow the same sequence. When you're in the front, you want to drive with the legs and then simultaneously open up the hips. Once the knees are extended and you're slightly leaning back, then you think about pulling with the arms. Once the handle connects with your chest, you do the same thing but in reverse. That means you want to extend the arms, close at the hip, and then ride the sled back forward. Now, if you struggle with this, we would always recommend taking it a step back and then practice the individual segments of the rowing stroke in order to perfect your stroke. Another technical drill you could use is rowing with a pause of the handle at the chest. So Anais is going to do 3 complete rowing strokes now, always pausing with the handle at the ribcage.
So handsome, oh, you have your way.
This brief pause at the chest allows you to think about what's happening next, which is the release of the arms, and then bending at the hip, and then bending at the knee.
Getting too much, but I can't pull back.
So if you struggle with exactly this part of the sequence, this is a drill we would highly recommend. Now let's talk about the force curve. The force curve can be a very useful and effective self-assessment tool on the rower because this gives you some insight into how the force is distributed across the stroke. Press the display button until you see this screen, and then continue pressing it until you can see a diagram. And as Anais is going to start rowing now, you can see that the force curve is coming up.
But you're deep in my mind, got a hold of me. When I'm awake, I'm all blind. You and your magic, like infinite power.
And here you always want to aim for a bell curve that is as smooth as possible, and you try to avoid any spikes at any point.
But you won't let me, no one.
As Anais was demonstrating efficient technique, you couldn't see any inefficiencies in her force curve. If you see curves like this, that means there's an inefficiency in your rowing stroke. If you see a spike in the end, that usually means that you're pulling too hard and too rapidly with your arms. If you see a big spike at the front, that means you're not having good timing of the hip extension into the sequence of the pull with the arms. Okay, lastly, let's go through some key workouts that help you to improve your specific needs when it comes to rowing. If it is peak aerobic power that you're lacking, that means high power output for a short duration of time, we recommend doing workouts with short intervals, like 30 to 60 seconds of work, and relatively short to moderate rest, also 30 to 60 seconds of work. A sample session could look like this. You do 8 rounds of 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, then you rest for 2 to 3 minutes, and then you complete that for a total number of 2 to 3 sets. Here it is important that while you're rowing, you want to be at an RPE of 7 to 8, and while you're resting, you either go complete rest or you row at a relatively light pressure, which equals RPE 3 to 4. If you haven't worked with RPE before, check out the video up here or down in the description. We got you covered. If you're ever struggling with moderate distances, let's say 500 to 1000 meters, we would consider a different approach. Here we would recommend 4 to 6 rounds of 4 minutes on, 2 minutes off, and at a similar RPE of what we just suggested. This is something we would describe as threshold repeats. That means during the first couple of rounds, you would feel like, I'm confident, I got this, we're at an RPE 7, and then over the rounds, the intensity creeps up, and then in the end, you finish at an RPE of 8. And again, during the rest, you either want to go for a full rest or row at a very light pressure, which should resemble an RPE of 3 to 4. Then finally, if you want to build a broader, bigger endurance base, we would recommend some base training, which is a continuous block of rowing somewhere from 30 to 60 minutes, but this needs to be done at a steady pace and at a rather low intensity. That means it should resemble an RPE of 4 to 5. This is usually described as zone 2 pace. This means you could use your heart rate as a second metric to track how you're doing during that workout. And what you should see here is that in the beginning, during the first couple of minutes, your heart rate is elevated slightly to a point where it stabilizes and then stays there for the rest of the interval. Now, this would only be an example of how to use rowing as a standalone form of exercise. But obviously, rowing is part of other sports like CrossFit or high rocks. If you're interested in how to implement rowing in these typical scenarios, we would highly recommend that you check out our specific programs for that particular matter. And you will find them in the description. We have a particular CrossFit program, but also we've got you covered in the high rocks world. That is everything for today. If you have any questions, let us know down below in the comments, and see you in the next one.